Hello, everyone. Today, Kurtz, tell us what we're talking about.
Right, this was a topic that I thought of just the other day. To give you a bit of backstory, to set the scene, to paint you a picture, dear viewer. I've been cleaning out the loft of late, and while I was up there last week, I managed to find my old PlayStation 2, which I haven't seen in years. So, naturally, I spent my Sunday last weekend playing PlayStation 2 games that I remember when I was a child. Been in an awfully nostalgic mood of late. And I couldn't help but think of the back in 2015 when it was announced that Disney would be making another Star Wars trilogy, and we started getting the first trailers for The Force Awakens. And I remember all of those reaction videos we got of grown men weeping and being moved to tears from viewing the trailer when the Millennium Falcon comes on screen. And that got me thinking, at what point does your nostalgia for something become unhealthy? And that's what we'll be talking about today.
Yes, I remember the soy faces as well.
Yeah, it was all very, very cringy and second-hand embarrassment sort of thing. It's, I'll just come out and straight and say it. Those sort of displays I found completely just gross. Just that a grown man, it's so unbecoming of a man to react like that.
I've actually never seen those the soy videos for The Force Awakens, but I do remember seeing videos taken outside of cinemas and movie theaters during the prequels, when the prequels were being released. I remember seeing these Star Wars nerds outside of cinemas waiting to go see the premiere of the prequels, and there's one video that just comes to mind of an usher just opening the door and these. I'm just going to say it, these two, very portly neckbeards running in, one of them falling to his knees and going, yes, with his arms over his head and things like that. And you get a weird secondhand embarrassment about that, I will say.
So we have the benchmark for too much nostalgia. Out of curiosity, do you think there's a reverse where there's too little or too little investment? I guess to me that would be something like somebody who's not getting enjoyment from any kind of media, I guess. I mean, even that's, I suppose, somebody who's just completely culturally isolated and has no points of reference. That would probably be the alternate extreme. But there are so few of those kinds of people that it's really hard to treat that as a proper benchmark.
This is the thing. This is going to be one of those conversations where it's probably going to be easy for people to misconstrue what we mean when we say these things. There is nothing wrong with enjoying media. There being things that you like if you like a series of games or a series of films. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong inherently with just being excited for those things. It's at a point it becomes a little bit too much. We've all got something. We've all had childhoods. We've all got something we're nostalgic for. But there's a point where it becomes too great a facet of your personality, where you become a little too invested in it. And I do struggle to think of a reverse.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And also, are you seriously implying that Rupert didn't just come out fully grown from the womb?
He's always been like this.
Always insufferable.
Yeah, so I think I'd agree. I think the reverse, whether you say that's just, okay, I really don't care about that, or whether you say that's, an abject dislike of something.
Or the counter circle jerk. That could be another sort of...
where you hate something too much.
Yeah, either you hate something too much, or you want to counter-signal someone else for enjoying something.
I mean, when you're thinking about literal reverse of childhood nostalgia, would that then just actually be that you hate all the childhood media you used to enjoy? You don't feel an attachment to it beyond just being why the hell did I watch or enjoy this shit? Would that be the opposite?
Or you're attacking, or like I just said, you're attacking somebody else for enjoying something that they're nostalgic about. So I don't know, maybe you're just tearing into somebody because they used to enjoy Sonic, just because of the other people that are associated with Sonic or whatever. As funny as that is, and I think we can all agree that it's hilarious, but...
Oh yeah, Sonic fans are a bunch of fucking creeps.
What was that about not getting on people's cases for liking what they like?
What?
I don't know. I mean, so there's some things that it's weird to like. I think that's a fair statement, and I'll give the example of someone I had at school. I would call him a friend of mine, but he was absurdly into My Little Pony.
Oh no!
Yeah, and he was a he, or is a he. He's not dead, as far as I'm aware. And it was just
Irony.
he was the type of guy that wasn't just, oh yeah, I like this cartoon for little girls. I watch it in my free time alone. Don't really talk about it. He was the type of person that would want to tell everyone the deep lore of My Little Pony, and I guess that's more onto discussion that I don't. Okay, I'm drawing the line where I don't think judging people for being far too into something is the exact opposite and just as bad as being far too into something, especially if it's something that is easy to judge you for.
Right. Well, this is the thing I was also going to bring up. That, like, that's another thing where it's not necessarily that someone's nostalgic for something, but a grown adult being a bit too into children's cartoons is another thing that I find somewhat disturbing. Like, if you're a grown man and you're dedicating your limited free time to watching cartoons made for children, when you could be interacting with something infinitely more intellectually stimulating, I find that to be an odd choice. And
I'm
again,
supposed to be the pretentious asshole here.
this is the one realm in which we're more learned than Rupert is media. Going to flaunt it as much as possible now that I've got the opportunity.
I mean, like a lot of things, it's limits and exceptions. Like, if a grown man told me he watches fucking Paw Patrol or something, but then he also has like a 4-year-old child, it's like, okay, I understand that then.
Yeah, then they're not watching it. It happens to be something that is on in the back. Like, if you're a grown adult who is seeking out, like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and spend my time watching SpongeBob and Looney Tunes or whatever. Like, as a grown man, I just find, as an adult, you should at least aspire to act more as an adult. I think this is one of those things we see a lot of online, of people just acting like immature man children and being proud of it. Almost being like, oh my god, I'm so mature. I'm still such a kid. I'm bad at being an adult. I don't think that's something that people ought to aspire towards.
You have to wonder then if some people will part of that mentality of deep diving back into your childhood, and I do mean like deep diving. I don't mean like literally when you said you pulled out your PlayStation 2. It's like, well, it sounds like you played it for a little bit and then you haven't played it since. There's nothing wrong with indulging in that sort of thing every so often, but maybe the issue is more when you get people who are so infatuated with their own childhood that they'd rather stay there in like a comfort blanket almost.
That's a good way of putting it. It's that refusal to grow up.
Yeah, like an ongoing self-infantilization. But I wonder how much that's kind of encouraged as a vector for continued consumption, basically. Just continue to consume thing. Like, this is one of the things that I've heard about the modern live-action Disney movies, is that effectively the marketing is geared more towards the adults who grew up with the movies rather than the children themselves, because they've got that sort of like single captured demographic that they've managed to keep in a sort of perpetually infantilized state. And maybe that's just going to be the new normal, or maybe it's just like a one generation thing, because so much has just continued to roll with this same generation. Where, I mean, going back to the Star Wars example, so a lot of these people come from Gen X, sort of maybe older millennial kind of demographic that grew up with the prequels, perhaps, or maybe experienced the original Star Wars trilogies, like only slightly after they were all out or something like that. That like it was very much a part of their childhood, and then Star Wars comes back when they're this kind of age, but it's still going primarily for that main demographic, that original demographic, or at least that's how it sort of manifests. Not necessarily that it was targeted that way, because as I understand it, Kathleen Kennedy was aiming more towards the sort of younger crowd, but then who actually ended up going to watch it? Mostly the Gen Xers, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can. If you're going to use the new trilogy as a benchmark, then I feel like we might have weirdly found the limit to people's nostalgia, because by the time The Last Jedi came around, it sounds like the people I know, like my brother-in-law is quite a big Star Wars fan himself, and with the final movie, he basically almost sounded like a battered housewife. He's just like, well, I'm invested, so I'll go see it, but I don't think I'll like it.
I think that was a lot of people's reactions to it, to be honest.
That was my reaction to it, I'll be honest.
Yeah, so it's quite clear that, and then it reflects in like how apparently it didn't do as well as other Star Wars movies at the box office. So it seems quite obvious then that even nostalgia has its limits, even for people who are in the comfort blanket, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, what was produced with the most recent trilogy is, I suppose, the equivalent of Star Wars spitting in your eye after you got all hyped for it again.
I mean, I can't remove the scene of Luke Skywalker and the milk from my mind. I just can't. I want to, but I can't.
And yet, we still have this iconic archetype of the soy face, and this comes after that Last Jedi spit in the eye.
Oh, okay. I know that the whole like soy boy and soy face thing is a meme that has been done to death, but it is something that I can't help but feel is relevant to this conversation. Like the amount of posts that like people have seen, that like even just we've seen on Twitter and on Facebook of grown men with terrible beards and thick rimmed glasses and awful upper body development, pulling the soy face with a Nintendo Switch, often with a self-deprecating caption, is they're near limitless, aren't they?
I mean, to maybe rephrase what you just said a little bit. It's not so much. Sometimes the caption is self-deprecating, but it's usually posted without any irony. So they don't think it's self-deprecating, but to the rest of us, we look at it and we go, "Oh God, no."
Well, this is a definite style, then, isn't it? So where's it coming from? Like, why are people so willing to sort of slip into this? I mean, to link it back to the original topic, slip into this like perpetual nostalgia, self-infantilization trope?
Because the real world is scary.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it is a everyone thing. I think there is a certain type of person that you get that just doesn't want to face the world, and so they retreat into their nostalgic urges, pleasures.
I never said that it was everyone who is like that, but at the same time, I think everyone has nostalgia for something, but very few people, I think, use it as a shield to perpetually infantilize themselves.
Yeah, I agree.
So, is there like just because I'm curious, does anyone here think there's like a healthy balance that you can have? Like, can you actually indulge in your nostalgic tendencies, or is it something that you should try to mostly leave behind?
No, of course you can. You can satisfy your nostalgia. Like Kurtz getting out his PS2 there's nothing wrong with enjoying the things that you used to enjoy and re-indulging yourself in that sort of thing. I think it is just when you take it too far.
Then let me take it to a slightly different place, because I'm also reminded of the plethora of tweets that were coming out, particularly between 2016 and 2020, talking about, or making comparisons between various fictional universes and present day like political goings on, basically. So perhaps you're comparing Donald Trump to Voldemort or something like that.
I knew this was going to come back around to Harry Potter and politics. I knew it.
Well, it's such an iconically like absurd comparison to make unless you're already in that mindset. And so I think there's something going on there where somebody basically has one foot in that fictional universe, whatever fictional universe they're very attached to on like a deeply emotional level, and then one foot, or maybe even sometimes just little more than a toe, in the real world and real world goings on.
See, this is precisely what I was thinking when your nostalgia becomes unhealthy. It's you're using this fictional universe, this media that you enjoyed as a child, and you are using it as a lens through which to view the real world as an adult. That is where I think something really starts to become a problem, where you see something you don't like in politics, and the only reference point that you can pin it to in your mind is Harry Potter.
You see, this is why I sometimes just hate hanging out with all of you, because then I get reminded of all the cringe I've seen. It comes flooding back to me like Nam.
I've seen things, man.
Yeah, posters of fucking Dumbledore's army.
Oh dear.
But yeah, I think there is something to that. The idea that somebody is viewing the real world through the lens of a fictional universe rather than viewing a fictional universe through the lens of real life.
I do wonder, like this was just a separate thought. I do wonder if it is that way around, or if it's more they're hanging out in communities based around the fictional universe, and one of them will make the parallel, or someone won't be into politics, and someone within their Harry Potter fandom, to carry on with that example, will say, Donald Trump is just like Voldemort, and then without knowing anything about Donald Trump, will just assign that connection.
I think that's just a completely different kind of stupidity where just, I know someone who said a thing that I don't know about, so I shall just associate it with that now permanently and not form my own opinion.
Why you gotta at me like that?
I mean, to add, I don't necessarily think that's even necessarily nostalgia related, if I'm being honest. Like, okay, maybe it's nostalgia related if it's someone around who's closer to, to my age. Yeah, let's just age myself right here, right now. But when I feel like it's almost that kind of viewpoint is almost understandable for like a young person, especially if they're like 16 or only a little bit older, like they're only just getting into their 20s, because by that stage, that's all they only have their childhood media as a lens to view things from. They haven't experienced enough yet, but when it gets into anything older than your 20s, basically, at that stage, it's like, what the hell are you doing? You shouldn't be viewing the world like this. It's too childlike and immature.
To take it back to your example, though, I think there's a subtle difference, though, that's taking place there that means that it probably is more leaning on the fictional lens to view the real world rather than the other way around, which is that they're saying that Donald Trump is like Voldemort rather than Voldemort is like Donald Trump. There's a subtle difference there, but it's almost like viewing from the Harry Potter universe, like the perspective of that sort of comment, and it is always that way around.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because if you say Voldemort is like Donald Trump, then you can say like, oh right, so like what? He's an incompetent ruler, or that these aren't necessarily my thoughts, but what someone who thinks like that might think. You're able to pin like, so he's going mad with power. He's abusing his power. His goals are unrealistic and driven purely by like race or whatever. So when you flip that from Voldemort is like Donald Trump to Donald Trump is like Voldemort, then you're saying, what? So he's a fucking space wizard? What? You're viewing it completely as backwards. You instead of taking real life examples and pinning that onto a fictional character, you're taking qualities of a fictional character and pinning that onto a real life person, which inevitably leads to, albeit an unkind comparison, but still ultimately leading to, so what are you trying to say? That he's got the power of dark magic and his followers can turn into black smoke? Just to take that in a uncharitable interpretation.
I mean, if you're going to be literal about that, then it already falls apart because Donald Trump has a nose.
Well, yeah, exactly. I suppose they're both of inhuman complexion.
Wow.
Back to what we were talking about last week, where it's less about specifically what Voldemort or particularly his qualities are. It matters just that he is the villain in the fictional universe that they most ascribe to, and viewing the world through the lens of there are things that are good and things that are bad and nothing in between. You're just pointing. You're using the big H analogy, but replacing the big H with Voldemort
With the big V instead.
Yeah.
To be fair, there is a much more charitable interpretation here, which is that the comparison is more rooted in or is more benchmarked against the fictional universe, because the fictional universe is the thing that people are more familiar with, which is also quite damning in itself, because that would suggest that people are much more invested or in tune with, in these particular communities at least, but regardless, much more in tune with that fictional universe rather than real world goings on. I.e., they understand the politics of Harry Potter better than they understand the politics of their own country in real life.
See, you said that was supposed to be a more charitable interpretation, but that might have just been the worst thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, like, that Rupert literally just put into words what we were all thinking, essentially, because that is actually kind of terrible. To bring it back to nostalgia, would you say that then that is where the real problem with indulging in nostalgia is when it takes you so far out of like real world events that you don't even necessarily know the own goings on in your country or in the world at large?
Yeah, exactly. When you're so embedded in these childish fantasies that when you're called upon to discuss something like real world politics, you don't have a base in history, in real world history, and so you have to draw from the only thing you do know, which ends up being pop culture, which ultimately undermines your position.
Yeah, I am self-admittedly like the least learned here when it comes to historical context for a lot of things, but even I can remember like Tony Blair policies and things like this, so that kind of throws me then, that you got people who can't even like maybe reference a decade ago.
Let's very slightly turn that into a virtue then, because I do think that there's also a possibility that you can do this for other realms that aren't fictional universes. I mean, that's the most crass and vulgar way of going about it when you're engaged with some kind of like consumer product, basically, and that's where you're drawing most of your emotional attachment from. But it can also occur in regards to either perhaps obscure ideas that have no real bearing on the world, or one's own life in particular, or even history. Getting too invested in history, and when that comes at the detriment of you actually living your life. I think that's probably something that I'm more guilty of myself to come clean about, I suppose. But yeah, I think the same.
Majorian reference. Put in the Majorian reference.
I think the same trend can apply there, and I think it taps into the same kind of place of like a pseudo escapism.
Yeah, ultimately, this is all the root. These are all problems coming from the same root of people being too heavily invested in and basing their personalities around one particular hobby or interest, and it leaves them as a somewhat incomplete person that they've only got one well to draw from, and it damages their ability to interpret different situations. I think the reason we see so many people drawing from these fictional universes is that it's just more common that someone's going to become overly attached to a fictional universe or like a franchise or video game than they are to become overly attached to philosophy or history.
Well, to be fair, a lot of these products are actually tailor-made, basically, to be loved like that, to become incredibly invested in. The amount of lore and such that's produced as part of a property like Star Wars. It's designed to try and take your attention, hold your attention, and get you to keep spending money on it. And it's practically scientifically designed so that you'll get, in some vague sense, kind of addicted to it. Whereas history isn't like that, obviously.
It's a lot easier to consume, like, because it's usually watered down is maybe the wrong word, but it's very straightforward. Like, if I guess we're gonna keep using references of things like Star Wars, especially in the original trilogy, was very dead simple. It was rebels good, Empire evil. I mean, look at the Emperor; he's literally a prune in a robe, and that's a very easy message to digest. Whereas trying to get someone interested in history or even dare I say real world politics, and you try to give them all the details, it becomes very messy and it can be hard to follow and difficult to process and consume, as it were. And I hate the fact that I am using this in reference to consumerism. Fuck you, Rupert. The marketability and consuming of products and everything, and that's where my brain immediately goes as soon as people mention it, because I'm just wired that way, I suppose. Mm-hmm. God, fuck this world.
I feel like the more we talk about this, the more sort of sympathetic I am to these people, because I suppose the alternative to, say, getting really into being Harry Potter, I wouldn't necessarily say is being really into history or politics, because those are things that you need to put in effort to learn about, and it's not necessarily the same sort of entertainment value as you're saying, these specifically engineered bits of fiction.
As much as you could say those take effort to get into, you can get a little bit too into it. Like, let's be perfectly honest, none of us don't really want to talk to someone who talks politics 24/7.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a complaint amongst sort of some of the more normal people I talk to are, he only talks about politics. It's just not interesting to talk about them. So if you're the type of person that is too into, I think the judgment to be made is, are you making yourself a very well-rounded and intellectually competent individual? And I think a lot of people aren't, especially the type of people that we're talking about.
Yeah, so to me, the comparison would be, if you're getting in a more physical realm, if you're getting your dopamine via lifting heavy weights versus beating your meat let's say. One is obviously much better than the other, but ultimately both have the potential to kind of overtake your life and be a distraction from the real world. But obviously one is much more carefully engineered to be deliberately that, and almost nothing but that. Whereas the other is virtuous in smaller or more reasonable doses. Let's say. Would that be a fair comparison?
Yeah.
It's a vulgar one, but okay.
Well, yeah. Guess the point across.
Also, just to bring something back, Henry said that he's feeling sympathy for people like that, and I will say I feel the same way, and I think that's maybe where a genuine feeling of cringe comes from, because you kind of recognize that you, at some point, that I have definitely been like that kind of person in the past, I know for certain, and that's why it makes me cringe, because it reminds me of myself.
I don't know if that's where the sort of cringe is coming from for me. I just find it kind of aesthetically vulgar. But definitely, if you analyse it, there is a sympathetic quality there, because it's somebody who is made a victim, I suppose, of kind of like modern vice or modern engineered vice. And there's plenty of that around. Like when you see somebody who's a gambling addict or something, it's the same kind of thing, because there's a whole industry that is built around trying to get you hooked on this thing that is quite unhealthy for you in the doses that it's very easy to fall into taking of it.
Yeah, ultimately it is sad that someone can end up so totally invested in a fictional property that only ever existed to suck money out of your wallet.
Oh, now I'm thinking of Transformers. Oh god, it gets worse the more you think about things.
Oh yeah, Transformers is one of the worst, because at least you could argue with Star Wars that in its most original incarnation, it did exist as the passion project of a bunch of talented artists, whereas now it's obviously a lot more vulgar. But yeah, something like Transformers, I don't think there was ever like an artistic kernel to that. It's just sort of consumerism all the way down.
Which to bring it back to something else we referenced as well. If I remember rightly, Transformers is a Hasbro property, and so is My Little Pony, and so both of those exist. Different demographics, but both of them basically exist to sell toys.
Yeah. I think I do agree with Simon there. I think there is a certain level of, not necessarily I was that, but I can definitely see the road that they've taken. So I can fully admit I've got a bit of a video game problem. I play a bit too many of those. It's not that different, but at least there are other things that I'm capable of talking about.
I mean, this was the thing I was going to say. I mean, throughout this conversation, the amount of times I've gone, that does kind of apply to me. I know, admittedly, way too much about Warhammer 40,000 lore, and that is taking up very valuable space in my head that could have been filled with something infinitely more productive.
Yep. The fictional universe to sell you inordinately expensive miniatures is just living rent-free in there, in your brain.
And it's working, and I know what they're doing, and I'm just letting it happen. That's the really bad bit.
When you're just like, my brain's being parasitised, but oh well.
A sentiment of this is perhaps required, though, for leisure purposes, but it's a case of not being sucked into it. It's not too bad if you're coming home after a long day at work and you're sitting down to watch a half-hour Netflix show. Other than the fact that you shouldn't be patronising Netflix, but by the way, it's a very different thing if you're coming home every day, binge watching a series, and then falling asleep with the laptop still on your legs. That's a very different thing. And so it's kind of finding the balance between having hobbies and pastimes that are simultaneously enriching in some way, but also sort of leisurely. So they allow you to kind of recharge, but are also hopefully giving you something else beyond just the dopamine hits.
What you want to do is get really invested in at least like 3 or 4 different things. That way you got at least a little bit of movement there. Get really into video games, but also get really into working out. And it'll balance each other out, kinda.
Almost.
Or if you could be building a skill.
Although in regards to your example, Kurtz, I'm pretty sure your brain might get a little bit resistant to the dopamine hits at that stage, if you're doing both.
Just add another hobby, then.
You can balance it out with some nice adrenaline. Take up rock climbing.
But be really bad at it.
Die before you're 50.
Okay, so to take this in a vastly different direction, I think to summarize what we've said so far, it seems to me like a lot of the issues we have with it is that obsession over certain topics and certain pieces of fiction stop you from being well-rounded as an individual, and it's definitely a vice. And part of the issue is that the reactions that people can have are, I think Kurtz used the term unmanly earlier.
Probably.
So if we're viewing it from this lens of bettering yourself and being a virtuous person, and again, very different direction here, do we reckon that there's, to a certain degree, a gendered component to this? As in, do people judge men more harshly just because of the expected reactions from, and by people I mean us?
I don't think they do necessarily, but they definitely should.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Rupert on that one. It seems very accepted, but I don't think it should be. And again, this is knowing full well that to say I was one would be an over-exaggeration, but I definitely feel like I could have easily gone down that path myself, and I think to myself, God, that's just... as Rupert's been saying, it's very aesthetically unpleasing.
To answer your question, Henry, yes, I do think that. Yeah. That women are just not held to this state. I mean...
Actually, let me throw in another comparison then. I think they're still being judged, just being judged slightly differently. Because, for example, what if I were to bring up the phenomenon of shipping or online fan fiction?
Why?
Yep, that's just completely rewired the way I was thinking about that. Thank you, Rupert.
Oh my God.
I don't know if I agree with that, because I feel like I judge... Okay, probably bad example, because she's my missus, but I judge my missus a lot less than I would, say, Kurtz for doing the same thing. Like, you sort of expect it in that situation from that person. So while it's still weird, it's less weird.
When they're younger, maybe they're not. When you find out like a woman in her 30s is doing it, you're then like, oh God, no, stop! No, you should not be doing that.
Okay, you've also rewired the way I was picturing that now.
It's that easy.
I think to a certain degree, a lot of the judgment comes from not being part of that same fandom. Fandom's not the word to use, but I'm going to keep using it. So, personally, not being really into Harry Potter just amplifies the amount of judgment I have for the people that are really into Harry Potter. Whereas someone... Sorry, go on.
Okay, I am someone who does really like Star Wars. I watched a lot of it as a child, so I do have that nostalgia for it. I did really like those films. But now, as an adult, I'm able to look at those other adults who are way too invested in it, and I'm able to go, okay, then that is, as much as you enjoy this property, that is an unacceptable way to be acting in response to it.
So do you have the sort of opposite, where you're judging them more because you know it's not worth that reaction? Or is it just the same to you?
I suppose I know what it's like to be a fan of something, because, as I've mentioned over the course of this conversation, I am a fan of lots of things like that. And yeah, it's not worth getting that emotionally invested in these things.
I definitely think the same way. Find me the kid shoving another kid in the locker meme, and I'll give you. I can basically write down any fandom on it, and that's basically what there'll always be. There'll be people who are way too into it, and then there are people who are just on the periphery who look at it and go, "Those people are weird," even though they're both technically part of the same fandom and community, for lack of a better term.
Is it just that weird people that get too into things are weird people that get too into things then?
Yeah, it's probably not helped that they find communities of people who are like-minded, and they just sort of bounce off each other. And that's how you get just obscure deep lore community discussions and people just getting way too into that kind of stuff, which in a way that wasn't possible before the era of the internet as we know it now.
I mean, I'd just like to point out that this is a phenomenon that is not just seen in these more typically nerdy sort of hobbies and franchises. Like, yes, there are plenty of people who are way too into video games and way too into Star Wars, but you meet guys who are just way too into working out. I know there was a guy that I used to speak to at the gym I used to go to, and he literally had nothing to talk about other than, I was just sitting there one day and he was just going on and on and on about his lifting routine and his diet and and how his numbers were being pumped up and stuff. I was just, in the end, I was like, can you just talk about anything that isn't lifting weights, please? So this is something that can affect something you wouldn't necessarily expect can still be affected by this.
Well, yeah, that's why I used the example of weightlifting earlier, because I think it can still apply there, and you've just given the perfect example of where that does apply. That even things that are traditionally considered as more of a wholesome pastime, they can be taken just way too far as well.
So it may not even necessarily apply to media. It could apply to nearly any hobby or pastime or just general activity.
In essence, we're reinventing or talking around the Aristotelian mean without actually mentioning it until now.
I didn't even know I was doing it. I've never even heard of an Aristotelian mean.
Well, the idea that there's virtue to be found in not going too far one way or the other in terms of certain behaviours. So it's the application is slightly different, but the kernel of the idea is still there. That even these things that are usually considered good in small quantities or are considered good to be pursuing, you can take it too far. And Aristotle was kind of putting forward the same idea with some of his the virtues that he was proposing. The idea that either being too courageous or not courageous enough are both vices, for example.
Well, like if you're too courageous, you're probably not big on your own self-preservation. Is that what he was getting at?
Yeah, basically that kind of thing. You're reckless. The additional layer that we're adding is that there are obviously things that are better to be pursuing, and there are things that are much more cynical that you could be pursuing. So, there are all these engineered, commercialized pastimes that you can, and fictional universes and such that you can get yourself really heavily invested in that exist for no other purpose than to sell you a product. Or there are these other things that can actually provide you something external that connects you more to the real world in some way. And obviously those are better to be pursuing, but you still don't want to. You don't want to be the guy who can't talk about anything but lifting.
Yeah.
And likewise, you don't want to be the only guy who can't talk about anything but pop culture. I'd just like to leave this on. I know that we've just said that it's not exactly virtuous to be getting yourself invested in these properties that exist only to milk funds out of you, but there is nothing wrong with enjoying them as long as it's not the epicenter of your personality, and that it's not the only thing that you are invested in. As long as it for as mealy-mouthed in a sort of pathetic and oh Jesus Christ, it took them an entire podcast to get to this. Everything in moderation.
Yeah, that's basically what we're settling on. What we're settling on, I'm guessing. Unless anybody has any final comments.
I was just going to say, do we all agree on that? And that's all I was going to say, but we can leave it there.
Well, everything in moderation, but like I said, there are some things that are better to do in moderation than others. It would still be better for you to be reading history than Harry Potter, but if whatever you got to do to unwind.
Fair enough.
What a lame way to end the show.
Well, that's what we're stuck with. Anybody want to leave it on something more spicy then?
I'm going to say the N-word.